Infrastructure is experiencing a transformative moment, owing to the rise of remote work, the digital revolution, urbanization, and a changing energy landscape, driven by AI's increased demand for data centers. So what opportunities exist for investors, and how can infrastructure investment not only build wealth, but contribute to a more efficient future? Welcome to The Bid, where we break down what's happening in the markets and explore the forces changing the economy and finance. I'm Oscar Polito. David Giordano is Global Head of Climate Infrastructure at BlackRock. David will help us explore the major structural forces driving this change, examine the role of private capital in bridging the financing gap for new energy investments, and help us understand how changes in supply chain strategies are influencing the infrastructure investment landscape. Well, David, welcome back to The Bid. It's been a while, but it's great to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So, David, infrastructure is very topical right now. In fact, Larry Fink talks about it in his annual chairman's letter. It's one of the main themes. So tell us a bit about how we got to this point. Why is infrastructure so topical?
Thank you, Oscar. It's really an exciting time to look at the landscape and see the opportunity set that exists around infrastructure investing right now, and particularly around the transition to the decarbonization of our economy. You know, we like to call it the golden age of infrastructure. I really like to think about this right now as the age of implementation. Having spent 25 plus years investing in renewable energy and being around the industry, we've never been at a place where we've had such fantastic alignment around public policy, around consumer demand, and around the technological innovation and maturity that we see in the industry right now. Just last year, we invested $2.2 trillion around the energy transition. That number is going to grow to $3.5 trillion by 2030. And as we get into the 2040s, it's going to be $4.5 trillion. That creates a massive investment opportunity for private markets to really fill the gap to fuel this broad transition to a decarbonized economy, and particularly around creating carbon-free sources of electricity generation. So a really exciting time, but it's also going to require a real all-of-the-above approach to this, because it's not just about the generation, it's also about the transmission and the distribution and the decarbonization of energy-intensive businesses like steel, like cement. Hydrogen will play a role. It's really going to be an entire ecosystem around the macroeconomic trends to really drive the transition. It's going to require this massive investment. So very exciting time.
Sounds like there's a lot of moving parts there. And you mentioned a couple of numbers, one of which was $4.5 trillion, which is the annual amount of investment that is going to be required in the 2040s to assist with this energy transition. There's another big number that comes to mind, which is the global population. Today, it's 8 billion. It's forecasted to go to 10 billion by 2050. I think a big reason for that is emerging markets and just the demographics in those countries. So I wonder if you can talk about how emerging markets will address the need for more infrastructure, and what opportunities does this present for investors?
Yes, this is a great opportunity to bring private capital into emerging markets and really create an opportunity to facilitate not just clean energy, but more importantly, probably energy access as you think about those markets. And I really think in emerging markets, we have an interesting opportunity from an energy perspective to leapfrog some of the technologies as well. If you think about phones, right? Emerging markets largely skipped landlines and went right to the mobile network. I think we're going to see some really great advancements on the technology side, whether it be microgrid, or other technologies that will facilitate this energy access as we go to a broader electrification of our use of energy. Electricity is set to grow to become the primary source of energy, just energy broadly. And emerging markets are really going to be leading the way in this space. I think the key to investing into these markets is really, thinking about where public capital and private capital can really work together. And, we've taken advantage of some opportunities to create blended finance. And I think that blended finance, if you think about that term, the goal of it is to really catalyze private capital to come in and invest into projects just like they would invest to them in those projects in the developed world. And so, as we look to the growth across these areas, I think it creates an enormous opportunity, and I think it's a fantastic opportunity to participate in what will be, I think, one of the most important things from just an overall, global stability perspective, because that access to energy and, low carbon energy in the developing world is going to be the biggest driver to meeting our decarbonization goals across the economy.
David, you mentioned global stability, and what comes to mind are geopolitics. The geopolitical landscape is something that we spend a lot of time talking about. And when we talk about those topics, things like energy security and nearshoring come up. So what do those things mean for infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a great point, Oscar. And as you think about this and you break it into those two components, you've got the nearshoring, the onshoring of manufacturing, and this is really, if you think post-pandemic, a desire for the economy to have a much more diversified supply chain. And really, as you think about the energy transition, that has diversification built into it as well. And when we think about that transition, it is an all of the above solution. And so there will be, fantastic opportunities to actually support that nearshoring and onshoring of manufacturing with clean energy, reliable energy, and low-cost energy. It's also going to create opportunities more broadly across the infrastructure landscape. It's going to be ports, it's going to be airports, it will be roads and highways as well to support, the reconfiguration, if you will, of the supply chain. That also then plays into the second point you made, which is around energy security. And you think about, Europe post Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it really highlighted the need to have a diversification of supply for your energy. And so again, that's solar, that's wind, that's natural gas too, as we go through this transition. Nuclear will continue to play a role, and in some countries play a more prominent role. And all of this kind of, again, fits into that broader theme, that broader opportunity set for infrastructure investing. The other thing I'd highlight too is you think about the policies, a big part of the policies has been about encouraging investment in domestic supply to support the transition. And if you think about something like solar modules, and then you look at a wind turbine, which has a much more diversified supply chain, I think all of these things start to fit together into, a much more secure and certain energy future and a decarbonized one.
And David, just for my own edification, when you say diversified supply chain, do you mean the way that we're powering the supply chain, or do you just mean that there are different component parts coming from a lot of different sources in the supply chain?
Both. I mean, the way that we're powering supply chains on the one hand, but on the other hand is where are the component parts coming from, to build out these power plants. And if you look at what is at the core of something like the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States, at the core of it, it's really a manufacturing. It's inspiring manufacturing. There's additional tax benefits associated with domestic content that creates an economic benefit for a project that can utilize that domestic content. So it all sort of fits in together into one broader ecosystem.
And so, David, maybe just switching gears for a second. You alluded to this a little bit just a second ago. The term private capital came up. In fact, one of the reasons Larry Fink touched on infrastructure in his annual letter was not only the need for it, but also how to finance these projects. And he touches on how governments are going to be challenged to finance these projects on their own, and that private capital will be needed in order for this infrastructure build out to come to fruition. So can you talk a little bit more about the role that private capital is going to play as we transition to a low carbon economy?
Private capital is going to be essential, Oscar, in really facilitating that transition. And so again, as you think about, sort of a deglobalization effort, if you will, around the geopolitical landscape, that plays into what we were just talking about as it relates to diversifying the supply chain, nearshoring and reshoring of manufacturing. And so again, all of those pieces fit together. We also have incredible stress on governments right now, just in terms of the debt service that they will have to be paying. And it's forecasted over the next couple of years, many of the largest economies in the world will be paying more in debt service than they are in defense spending. And so that means that they're not going to be able to finance the infrastructure needs on their own. They're going to need private capital to play a role in this. And frankly, private capital is really well positioned to invest in the development and then the long-term ownership of these projects and really be, again, that facilitator of investment into these long-term infrastructure opportunities.
Right. So what you're saying is that infrastructure investment is too expensive for governments to handle on their own, and that's where private capital is going to step in to assist.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. There is just no scenario that you can paint and say that governments can absorb all of the capital needs on their own. And private capital is in a great position. And there's a huge demand from institutional capital providers to have access to those types of investments. I think the other piece to this, as you think about it, is, government has some role in the financing side of it, but really it's more important that government sets up the right policies, has the right regulations in place to really facilitate the transition at scale. We were just talking to some of our partners in the industry, and it's estimated that there's about 40 gigawatts of projects in the United States that have signed interconnection agreements but are unable to go forward with construction because they don't have their local permitting in place. And so, government's role, yes, there's a financing component to it, but more importantly, it's about setting up the right institutions, having the right processes and regulations in place to really, create then the efficient flow of capital into these assets where there's quite a bit of institutional money that is looking for access to those uncorrelated to public markets cash flows.
So, David, we're talking about megaforces. We touched on geopolitical fragmentation. There's another one that comes to mind, which is demographic divergence. In fact, we recently had a conversation with Peter Fisher and Nicholas Fawcett about this exact topic. Demographic divergence, essentially talking about the fact that populations are aging very differently in different parts of the world. And so this has an impact on demographic shifts, on urbanization, and it makes me wonder, how does infrastructure then play into this?
So look, as you think about the demographic shifts and you think about the differences between, again, the developed world and the developing world, we were recently at an event with the president of Kenya where the average age in Kenya is 19 years old, right? That's vastly different than looking at a country like Japan or even the United States. And so as we think about that, that also implies further urbanization, which means, again, it's not just going to be centrally generated power that's going to be able to facilitate that growth in urbanization. We're going to need to have the structure in place to facilitate, behind the meter, which by that I mean rooftop solar and battery energy storage that's localized, really, generating power at the distribution level, being much more responsive, having a smarter grid, smarter metering to, inspire behavior to use power more efficiently. Energy efficiency, which is not something we've talked about, but that plays into, this broader infrastructure need to support the energy needs of that population growth. And so, that all of these need to kind of work together, right, to really make it feasible and ensure that there is reliable, inexpensive, and clean energy available to support that growth.
Well, I have to say, I know there are countries that have a younger population than the developed world, countries like the US and Japan, but I had not heard a statistic like the one around Kenya that you just mentioned, and it really brings to life that divergence in demographics that we talk about. I also start to think about how the world has evolved over the last few years, post the pandemic, the rise of hybrid work, the rise of video streaming, of course, the rise of artificial intelligence. How does this reshape the demand for infrastructure projects?
Yes, Oscar, it's a really great point, and it again, as you think about the investment opportunity, right, there was $35 billion spent on data centers last year. That number is going to approach $50 billion by 2030. So, we're just going to continue to see massive investment as we see the growth of artificial intelligence, but also just, the broader use, as you point out, streaming, just increased remote work. It's just going to continue to put more pressure and create more demand around data. Going back to our earlier part of our conversation, the increase in manufacturing capacity, more broadly dispersed, throughout geographies, is going to increase electricity demand. And so, as we think about that creates opportunities to invest then in the generation technologies that can meet that demand and can meet it at low cost and with low carbon intensity. I think the other thing to think about with this too is, again, it's getting a lot of press lately, but if you think about the average, search you do on your computer, and then you think about, putting in an artificial intelligence prompt, I mean, AI actually requires about 10 times the energy as sort of the normal, regular way Google search, if you will. And so, if you extrapolate that out, by 2026, we estimate that demand just for data centers will equal the demand of Japan. So, just to put it in context, it's just going to be a massive shift. It's going to create investment opportunities in data centers, but it's also going to create a massive shift in just the way we generate and use electricity.
So, David, you've given us a lot to think about here. In particular, when people hear infrastructure, or maybe they think about roads and bridges, and maybe they stop there. That's sort of the more traditional way of thinking about infrastructure. But you've made the point that it's much more than that. It's really about thinking about how are we going to power this digital revolution that we're experiencing. So if we bring it back to the end investor who's thinking about infrastructure, what should they be considering when they're looking at the investment opportunity set?
Oscar, I think as you think about infrastructure investment opportunities, you want to think about a couple of key components, and it's really based on the fundamentals. I think first and foremost, you want to be focused on infrastructure where that is in the fast movement of demand, right? We've talked a lot about power demand. And as you think about how are we going to meet those demands, it's an all of the above solution. So just sticking to the energy side, you really want to think about all of the areas that are going to provide that reliable, low cost, low carbon energy. And that really is, technologies ranging from classic wind and solar investments. Natural gas is going to play a key role in facilitating the transition, especially as we have more and more coal retirements. I think as an infrastructure investor, you want to keep your eye on what's happening in the nuclear world. I mean, SMRs and other technologies are going to continue to progress and reach commercialization. But I think, you really want to see the trends. You want to focus on decarbonization. I think you want to focus on cost, and I think you want to focus on reliability and really pay attention to that fundamental, pay attention to the demand fundamentals, and then look for attractive investment opportunities with that sort of foundation.
Well, I have to say, David, you have put a lot of structure around infrastructure, meaning that I think you've helped us understand all the different components of it, the broader definition that exists. And I'm kind of left thinking back to some of the numbers that you shared. The fact that over $2 trillion a year is invested in this space right now. It'll be in the $3 trillion a year by 2030 and in the $4 trillion by 2040. So this promises to be an important topic for many years to come. Thank you for sharing all these insights, and thank you for doing it on The Bid.
Thank you very much, Oscar. It was a real pleasure and an honor to be here.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Bid. Next week, I'll be talking with Axel Christensen about Latin America's strategic economic shift in the global market.